In this last lecture in the module, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change. We've talked about climates and we've talked a great deal about the heating and the cooling of the planet and how atmospheric processes work. So this is a great opportunity in a course which is mostly about explaining the basic types of atmospheric and climate patterns we see, or landform features that we see that we'll talk about in the next part of the course, to talk a little bit about a very important scientific phenomenon that is impacting everyone. And that, of course, is the changing climate of the Earth. Now, we already know, having talked about heating of the planet earlier in the course, that what causes the atmosphere to heat is this balance between the amount of sunlight that comes in and the amount of thermal energy that goes out, and the Earth's ability to hold on to that energy for a longer or shorter period of time based on what sort of gases there are in the atmosphere, or how much cloud cover there is, or how much water vapor there is as well. Now, the planet can heat or cool if A, the amount or quality of insulation that reaches the atmosphere fluctuates or changes. It can also change when the atmosphere's composition changes in some way, either increasing or decreasing the efficiency of its ability to hold on to that thermal radiation that the sun brings in the form of insulation. There are a large number of natural mechanisms of climate change. These include, number one, solar variability. The sun goes through cycles, sunspot activity cycles, where there's greater amounts of energy and smaller amounts of energy. And we can see this fluctuation in this diagram right now. And you can actually see that we're sort of entering right now a lower energy cycle. The Earth, as we know, is tilted on its axis as it revolves around the sun in an elliptical orbit. All three of those variables can change somewhat. The Earth wobbles somewhat on its axis, and that means that it is not always pointed towards the sun at the same point on its orbit around the sun, meaning that the timing of summers and winters in the northern and southern hemisphere can vary somewhat. The axis as well changes slightly over long periods of time as the Earth wobbles on its axis, and the elliptical nature of the orbit changes as well. All these variables put together produce very broad, what are called Milankovitch cycles, that mean that there are periods of greater amounts of energy that reach the planet and times when there's less energy that reaches the planet as well. We're roughly in the middle one right now, neither particularly warm nor particularly cold. But this is one of the key factors for what creates ice ages and the periods in between ice ages. And then a third thing that can change over long periods of time naturally is the nature of the atmosphere. It can have greater amounts of carbon dioxide, greater amounts of methane, and greater amounts of other gases that are very important in the greenhouse gas process we talked about before, based on what's happening in the planet in terms of what sort of life there is, and also in terms of things like volcanic eruption and the emission of gases into the atmosphere. The upshot is, right now, that most of the natural mechanisms of climate change are causing neither a warming nor a particularly rapid cooling of the Earth's atmosphere. But human atmospheric impacts are leading to changes in the atmosphere's heating. We are, through human activity, increasing the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And remember, that term greenhouse is a little bit problematic, but it refers to this idea that the atmosphere heats indirectly somewhat from the infrared radiation that is emitted by the planet. It's also directly heated as well. But there are certain class of gases that are very good at absorbing the infrared radiation. And these are the so-called greenhouse gases that include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and a range of others. And there's really no question right now that these gases are being increased as a result of human activity, not only through the burning of fossil fuels, but also by the way that we engage in agriculture and the way that we engage in a lot of industrial activities as well. As we can see from the charts that are shown right here, carbon dioxide and methane have both increased dramatically compared to what they were over the last thousands of years in the past. This means that humans have induced a climate change that is leading to a greater amount of heating because the Earth's atmosphere is becoming more efficient at holding on to infrared radiation over long periods of time. And the evidence for this is pretty clear. It includes surface temperature changes. In other words, temperatures are getting warmer as measured near the surface of the Earth. Rising levels of the ocean as a result of melting of ice, particularly in large ice sheets like Antarctica and Greenland. We know that there are lots of different impacts of climate change, and Geography A111 really isn't the best place to talk about this. An environmental science class or an environmental studies class would be the most appropriate place to do this. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but you can review in the textbook some of the impacts that are discussed there, as well as a couple of others that I think are pretty important that are useful to reflect on for things we'll talk about later on in the course. As I already mentioned, sea levels are rising. This is going to ultimately lead to coastal flooding in a lot of parts of the world. There'll also be more severe weather over the course of the next hundreds of years as a result of these increasingly warm temperatures, because as we know now, the Earth has a much greater ability to hold on to moisture than it did in the past. So that means that there'll be more water vapor in the atmosphere, and warmer temperatures will also lead to greater atmospheric processes of cloud formation, precipitation, etc. This will necessarily lead to greater amounts of flooding and flood risk in many places. Something we're going to talk about at the very end of the course will be soil. Soil is extremely important to humans, although it might not be a particularly exciting topic to think about. But of course, soil is where we grow all of the food that we eat. And soil is impacted by climate change in two ways. One, increasing amounts of flood and river runoff, both of which we'll talk about in this class, can lead to greater amounts of soil erosion and loss of good soil for agriculture. But another thing that's very important about a changing climate is that the amount of moisture in the soil and its basic chemistry is changed as a result of warmer temperatures as well. And as you'll see when we talk about soils later on in the course, that's a really important thing to help us understand how soils form and what sorts of productivity they have. And this, of course, directly impacts different ecosystems, not only soil changes, but also temperature changes and moisture changes as well, meaning the types of plants and animals that can survive in different parts of the world are at risk. The last thing I'll briefly talk about with regards to climate change and science is that we need to remember that climate change science uses very rigorous system of trying to study and understand the world that starts with what we've already talked about in this class and what you've already worked on a physical geography assignment on, observing and measuring the temperature and precipitation data that are found at weather stations all around the world. And then using those data to classify into different climates and to understand what sort of changes have occurred in the long-term classification of climates over time. This empirical evidence allows scientists to build theories, to model using geographic information system and other manner as well, to understand how climate is changing and how it's likely to impact different parts of the world. And all of this scientific information and scientific findings are reviewed very closely by peers who are experts in the field and who critique the studies that are done. Now, of course, it's possible to critique science, and in fact, we should critique science. There are problems with scientific process and empiricism often, and there are also problems with peer review from time to time and the way that that peer review takes place. And there can be a politicization of science as well. But these critiques of science, which are very healthy, skepticism is healthy and should be embraced, shouldn't be what guides us in our public policy about climate change and how we think about climate. Climate change is accepted among something like 97 to 98% of all climate change scientists based on some meta studies of climate change research. So it is very much settled science, which can still be critiqued, which should still be treated with healthy skepticism. But we need to be basing what public policy decisions we make about climate and climate change on the idea that climate change really is happening because the evidence is so strong, while at the same time embracing critiques of how we think about this. So that's all I have to say right now about climate and climate change. Happy to have more discussion with you if you'd like to pursue it with me on an individual level. This part of the course is drawing to an end now, and we will start on after this in a look at landscapes and landforms.